Moot. My name is David Peterson, and this is The Art of Language Invention. Episode 20, Evolving a Future Tense. When it comes to evolving bits of grammar, I love talking about the future tense because the future tense is the easiest one to explain in terms of its evolution. This is probably because most languages can get by without one. And here's an example from English. I am going to Comic-Con on Wednesday. That is a future statement, but notice there's no future morphology anywhere in there. In fact, that was present tense progressive. That's about as present gets in English, and yet that was a future statement. In fact, there are languages that do that just by default. One of them is Finnish. If you want to learn the future tense in Finnish, just learn the present and you'll be fine. It's like, well, but then how do you tell if it's present tense or if it's future? It's absolute madness. Well, go back to my sentence in English. I'm going to Comic-Con on Wednesday. How did you know that was in the future tense? Even if you're watching this many years from now, how did you know that when I said that would be in the future tense? It was because I used the present and then a time expression on Wednesday, rather than a past tense like I went to Comic-Con on Wednesday. That's obviously in the past tense, but it has kind of double marking, both the on Wednesday and the... No, I guess it doesn't. No, it's just past tense marking. So yeah, it's the present tense marking plus some sort of time expression, with the implication being that if you're saying it's in the present and you're also giving a time, and it's obviously hasn't happened yet, so you haven't used the past tense, it must be in the future tense. So something like Finnish does that by default. In English, we just use it as an option for one of our many options for the future tense. Anyway, but because these things don't really need to exist in a language, they typically come about very, very late. And because they come about very, very late, we can track their etymologies and their evolutionary histories fairly easily. So we know a bunch of different paths to grammaticalization for future tenses in various languages. Here are some of the most common. One very common strategy for producing a future tense is what we call the go future. This is where you take a verb go and it becomes either an auxiliary or some sort of a particle that places the sentence in the future tense. We have this in English, we see it in Spanish, we see it in French. It's actually in a bunch of languages all over the world. It's very common. You can see how it evolved in English fairly easily. Imagine sometime way in the distant past, if somebody asked, what do you, or what do you do? You could respond, I go to London to eat. In other words, you're going to a very specific destination because a verb of motion requires a destination, and then when you get there, you're going to perform some sort of activity, very common. Pretty soon, though, you could just drop out the destination and just say what you're going to do whenever you got there. So I go to eat. But then, of course, verbs evolved, and the way that we used our verb tense evolved a little bit. So rather than saying I go to eat, you would say I am going to eat. And then pretty soon you said I'm going to eat. Then pretty soon you said I'm going to eat. Then it became I'm going to eat. Then it became I'm going to eat. And then I think we missed the go because now you can say I'm going to go eat. You can have it reintroduced. It's so much fun. Anyway, so pretty obvious what its evolutionary track there was. We can even go as far back as I'm going to eat now. So it's like you can see it, even though this is something that evolved more than 150 years ago. So that's why, why it's so nice to look at the etymologies of future tenses. You can see where they came from. Anyway, so this is one strategy, super common. Another common strategy is to use a word that means something like, has to do with debts, or a verb meaning to owe, or something along those lines, some sort of obligation. That is, you have a debt to do something, and if you have a debt to do something, that thing is going to necessarily take place in the future. Same with the go future, actually. This is a key feature of how we get these future tenses. If you're going somewhere, you're going to get there at some point in time in the future. If you have a debt to somebody or you owe something to somebody, you're going to give it to them or pay them back at some point in time in the future. Think about that when you're thinking about evolving a future tense. Anyway, for a debt and owe strategy, we don't need to leave English yet, because our word shall actually comes from an old word going all the way back to Proto-Indo-European, meaning to owe or to owe somebody a debt. And so it was skell became skal and whatever, and then it became shall in the way that all the ska became shas in English. or in Germanic at some point. And so I shall do this meant originally like I owe doing this, and then that became the future tense. And in fact, just out of curiosity, what do you think the past tense of the verb shall was? It's should. And that's where we got it from. So should is the past tense of shall, and that turned into something like, obligation. That, of course, happens at some point in time in the future. So this is another common strategy. Let's move on to the next one. Next is a volitive, so a word like want or desire or even love. This is something that you can marry with a verb, saying that, I want or I like or I would like to do something, and then that necessarily is going to happen in the future, or I guess there would be no reason for you to talk about wanting to do something unless you were planning on doing it at some point in time in the future. And so words like that can become future tense markers. This is where our main or our old main future tense marker came from. So will, of course, we still have will as in, do what you will. Will meaning want, what your desire is. That was what it used to mean, and then it came to mean future tense in English. So a lot of languages use this as a strategy as well. Another common strategy is to use just some sort of word that has something to do with the future and just have that become the future tense marker. So in Arabic, Arabic has this word sofa, or at least the dialect I learned was pronounced sofa. Anyway, it comes from a verb sawafa, which means to delay, or my favorite, to procrastinate, to put off. Great word. Anyway, so sawafa is a verb, and you can still use it in that way. But it had this kind of particle form, sofa, that just ended up getting put directly in front of the present tense form of the verb. So adhab, I go. Sofa adhab, I will go. Same thing with any other verb in the present tense, nice and simple. And it even got shorter, just like English's did. Now you can just take sofa and just make it sa, a prefix. So adhab, I go. Sa adhab, I will go. Yadhab, he goes. Sa yadhab, he will go. Wonderful, wonderful, darling little piece of verbal morphology. In fact, that's like the only productive verbal morphology prefix. And no, it's got other prefixes. In the present tense it does. The agreement prefixes. They're all prefixes. But anyway, pretty cool. Pretty cool that it happens. It just you just stick it on the front, and now it's future tense. But as you can see, this is a recent development, which is why it's still well known that sa came from sofa. When these things happen way in the distant past, often you lose whatever word it originally came from, and people just don't know it anymore. But once writing was evolved, people it lengthens your memory. People remember it, and that's why we see a lot of these future etymologies, because we know where they came from. We have records of them, so they kind of stay in the public consciousness. We learn about them, and so it makes it easy to know how these future tenses evolve. Next is using some sort of non-finite form, but not really a participle, so more like an infinitive to make a future tense. You can do this in English, so it sounds a little stuffy or formal if you say something like, I am to speak on Wednesday. We know that that's something that's going to happen in the future tense, and that's kind of a strategy that's unique, or it's uniquely future tense. So you could just say, I am to speak, and the implication is that it's going to be happening either in the immediate future or distant future, if that's what the time reference is at that time. You can use this as a productive future strategy for your conlang. I've used it a couple of times. So in one, this is a language called Nola that I did for the Shannara Chronicles. The standard present tense for something like sleep would be hichomhus, that's I'm sleeping, where comes from an old word meaning stand. It's kind of a locative copula type of thing now. And so this would translate, I guess, most literally as I am at standing, or I am in the vicinity of, I'm sorry, not sleep, I'm sleeping. I'm in the vicinity of sleeping, I am at sleeping, and so that becomes the regular present tense. For the future tense, there's some other funky jazz that happens. So for the future tense, you would say, hium thombashi. And what that means is I will sleep. But literally, it's kind of like, how to say this, there is sleeping by me, or there will be sleeping by me, or to sleep is by, or to sleep by me is, or is to be, is to come. That's kind of how the future tense evolved there. It's a fun one. Another one that's more like the English that we use is from Shivaisith, which I did for Thor the Dark World. So for that one, to say I'm sleeping, you'd say Kirnirer, I'm sleeping. That's pretty simple, just verb, pronoun, agreement marker. For the future tense, then you would say Kir er nirhi. Here you have the same pronoun. Ar is just the copula in the first person singular conjugation, and nirhi is to sleep in the infinitive. So very, very similar to the English strategy, but this is the common way to form the future tense in this language. You also find plenty of other strategies and words that lend themselves well to future tenses. So this could be anything from words like just a word meaning tomorrow, word meaning later. There's one where it's like, or there are a few where you use take as a word. Anything that has to do, anything that kind of sets this up as something that is not happening right now and hasn't happened in the past, but is going to happen or is fated to happen. You also see have used a lot like this in senses like I have to do this, becoming a future tense. Anything like that is liable to lend itself to becoming a productive future tense. However, something I would note, and this is an important takeaway for any grammatical feature that's being evolved, these things carry their history with them in strange ways. So for example, imagine the scenario where you have a friend, you're at a friend's house, and the friend says, oh my goodness, I am totally out of fish and I need to fertilize my flowers. And then you can respond in one of two ways. Way one, I'm going to the store. Way two, I'll go to the store. Notice how those are different? They're both nominally future tense in English, and we don't even think of them as different, but there's a key difference between these two. In the first one, if you respond after your friend has said this, and you respond, I'm going to the store, the implication is that you were already going to do it. You were heading to the store later, so you might as well go now and pick up the fish for your friend who is really bizarre and likes to bury fish with the flowers, which is strange. You honor fish by presenting them with flowers. You don't bury fish for the flowers. It's disgusting. For the second one, though, I'll go to the store. The implication is exactly the opposite. Both of these are future tense. But the implication is that you were not going to go to the store. You did not have any kind of a plan to go to the store. But since this situation has arisen, you are volunteering to go to the store at some point in time in the future for your bizarre and kooky friend. And the reason that there is this difference is because if you go back in the history of will, which of course has become the apostrophe LL and I'll go to the store, will originally had the sense of wanting and desire, something that has to do with your own will and volition. And that little bit has been carried along with it through, the hundreds of years that English has existed, so that now there's this contrast. And of course, when you're talking about just traveling, there is no such implication. That little bit of meaning was never there, and so it never developed. And so you can have this alternation. These are things, these little details like these exist throughout natural languages. And they exist because of the way these structures have evolved and the way that they've been used throughout time. And they're very, very difficult to learn, very tricky. It's always easy to pick out a native speaker from a non-native speaker because they don't know these things. And they're doubly hard to create for a conlang. But if you're creating a naturalistic conlang, they're super important because just as it's easy to pick out, a native speaker from a non-native speaker, it's easy to pick out a naturalistic conlang that's doing a good job versus an obviously fake one because they lack these type of little details, or they're kind of implemented in a clunky ad hoc fashion where you just say randomly, oh, and this also means this for no reason other than I'm trying to add some detail to my conlang. You can get this stuff for free if you're evolving these structures in the right way. That is, you know exactly where the grammatical material came from, you know what it originally meant, you know what other competing structures there were, like, go versus will in English, and so you know how it retained this stuff and what it retained specifically. For an example of this, I will give I didn't want to do this, but right, I'm going to do it. The future tense in Dothraki actually has kind of a fun evolution. I didn't want to get into it because this also gets into kind of subjunctive stuff, but the future tense for Dothraki evolved from a combination of an old preposition and the present tense form of a verb. And it evolved in subordinate structures where you would say something like, I hope for, or there's some sort of a preposition, and then rather than putting some sort of an NP, you'd put another verb clause. So like, I hope for I go to, I don't know, Vice Dothrak. That's the only place they go, really. That is, rather than I hope for fish, it's like I hope for I go to Vice Dothrak. So you're hoping for some situation that contains a verb. Well, the preposition glommed onto the front of the verb and just became like a little subordinate form. And that subordinate form itself kind of lost some of its original purpose and got dragged out to the matrix clause where it became a future tense. And so now you have a future tense that looks like the present tense just with a prefix on the front. Kind of like the Arabic future tense, but evolved in a very, very different way. But because of that, the future tense in Dothraki has a very unique and seemingly bizarre secondary sense. So you can do something in Dothraki where you say, like, I hit him in order to teach him. So you can say something like that. I hit him in order to teach him. But the in order to teach him part is actually just the future tense. So you don't use a secondary construction. There's no separate verb tense. There's no little in order to morphology that happens there. You actually just use the future tense of the word, and it carries the meaning of in order to. And that happens exclusively because of the history of Dothraki and its use in earlier subordinate clauses. And it's something that I never would have just dreamt up on my own. It's just made sense because that's how the tense evolved. So those are the type of things that you want to try to implement in your naturalistic languages. It'll make them look more authentic and also give them more nuance without you having to just dream up stuff and just shove it or shoehorn it in there. That's it for this episode. If you have a question that you'd like for me to answer on the show, leave it in the comments or send me an email at djpquery@gmail.com. If you want to see more episodes like this one, feel free to subscribe. Thanks for watching.